Welcome back to the Decline and Fall show, everybody. There is a saying floating around in American policy circles which goes as follows: if you can't win the real war, win the imaginary one. And that is of particular relevance when we examine the policies of the United States and the actions of the United States towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, over the last few days, you could not fail to see on the various Western imperialist news channels, I should say, the various scenes of, should we say, very carefully curated footage coming from supposed protests in Iran that were rocking the regime to its absolute core. The proclamations from the White House and from all the usual suspects from London and Paris, Berlin, Brussels were screaming that the Iranian people are demanding freedom and we are ready to come to their aid. Trump was ready to go, apparently, with humanitarian bombing. Lindsey Graham and various others were getting very excited about the idea of restoring the Shah and or some other character to power in Tehran. However, as with the previous times they've tried this, and I'm now old enough to remember at least 4 previous occasions when they've got this excited, dating all the way back to the so-called Green Revolution, about 16 years ago, this all fell on its face in the end. The demonstrations that carried on became increasingly violent, but were demonstrations of fewer and fewer people. Most regular Iranians, even those who have profound objections to the Islamic Republic's system of governance, reject violence. They reject the ISIS-style actions of those who are, by the admission of Mike Pompeo, whose Ozempic prescription seems to have addled his brain, Mossad assets, as he admitted in a Twitter post recently. So we've got a situation where, due to real problems in Iran related to economic mismanagement, which is partially down to the Pezeshkian government and partially down to the rather contradictory nature of the Iranian economy and state, there were, of course, strikes and protests from workers towards the end of last year. These all disappeared, though, when the networks of Mossad, the CIA, MI6 were activated, and they activated the violent mercenaries and violent agents of theirs who were on the ground in Iran, who immediately tried to create the same kind of crisis that we have talked about so often when we talked about color revolutions. And go back and watch our episode on victims of capitalism if you want a rundown of the kind of tactics that they use, which are, of course, always upping the ante in terms of violence and then continually screaming that the state's being violent, including faking eruptions of violence that are alleged to have come from the state, but in reality come from those who are aligned with the so-called protesters. In Iran, this consisted also of bombings of mosques, bombings of police stations, beheading people, killing a 3-year-old girl, and trying to torch a bunch of children hiding in a mosque. This is the kind of action that you get from the assets of the CIA, Mossad, and MI6. Fortunately for Iran, though, this seems to be petering out. Now we're seeing vast anti-Western demonstrations, which are in support of the current government and against the idea or the prospect of armed intervention by the imperialist powers, and against the so-called protests, in reality, violent thugs who go around gunning people down, beheading people, and setting things on fire. So whereas 2 days ago, Donald Trump, Lindsey Graham, Keir Starmer, Kaya Kallas were getting very excited about the prospects of a color revolution in Iran or some kind of system collapse, now it's all petering out again. Now we will see the dance begin anew, and it is upon this discussion that our show will be turning today. So, Kit Klarenberg, over there in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, you have written quite extensively about the war on Iran. Now, according to your research and analysis, where does this latest effort, which, by the way, they're openly admitting to, Pompeo was admitted to it, the Times of Israel was admitted to, the Jerusalem Post was admitted to, this is a Israeli operations. What does this fit in the history of the hybrid war on Iran, do you think?
Well, none other than Wikipedia has provided provides a very instructive list of protests in Iran since 1999. Each and every time these protests happen, we were told that this was the end of the Islamic Republic and had been taken over by anti-regime activists. This spans student protests in 1999 and 2003. The Green revolution, which you cited earlier, which was around the time of the 2009 Iranian presidential election, which prompted the Obama administration, which had hitherto tried to maintain constructive relations, at least formally, with Tehran, to start funding create a specific budget for anti-government protests, which is quite extraordinary and doesn't get talked about enough. And then every few years we've had these grand protests in Iran, which are clearly not organic, which are clearly being stirred up by foreign chaos agents, whether they're inside the country. And each and every time they have ended in abject fear. And actually, it usually the upshot is strengthening the legitimacy and the credibility of the Islamic Republic amongst the wider Iranian public, including Iranians based abroad, because. Among my investigations into Western support for the Iranian quote unquote opposition, as much as this exists in a coherent way, is the fact that over the past 10 years, whenever there's been a flare up of local dissent on a variety of issues, and there, of course, some people will have legitimate grievances. Not least because Iran is subject to absolutely crippling sanctions, which makes life pretty miserable. For a great many people in the country, which has a population of 80 million. The each and every time the West and Israel have sought to promote the son of the Shah of Iran, who was installed as an absolute monarch in 1953 by the British and the Americans, and had to flee due to the Iranian Revolution in the late 1970s. They promoted him as the country leader in waiting. Now, in a bitter irony, his endorsement of protests in Iran is usually sufficient to just kill them dead. Like, it's a kiss of death. Pahlavi saying that he supports this or that protest movement. And we saw this very palpably in late 2022. There was what was known as the Women Life Freedom Movement, which was a kind of anti-hijab, and there were these grand protests all over Iran. The second that the Shah's son and other Western assets endorsed these protests and also came to be leading them, they died off completely. Because Iranians are not stupid, and irrespective of their grievances, they don't want this to be resolved in a flurry of airstrikes by US and Israeli fighter jets, let alone an all-out coup cooked up by the CIA and MI6. But they keep doing it. Which is quite amazing, and I don't think it's a coincidence that these protests follow the kidnap and abduction of the Venezuelan President Maduro and his wife. The empire is a beast cornered, lashing out, as violently as possible and gnashing its teeth. But when it comes down to it, their ability to influence events in Iran is actually very limited. And in the wake of we had the 12-day war last summer, which in its initial stages, when there were Mossad cells in the country carrying out sabotage and wrecking missions, Israeli officials, including internationally wanted war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, were stated this is the end of the theocratic fascists in Tehran. Very, very quickly, Israel found itself in like real trouble due to wave upon wave of Iranian missile strikes, which they couldn't repel. The much vaunted Iron Domes demonstrated to be this hollow white elephant. So, quite clearly, there is an ongoing effort. Or well, the second that there's the tiniest bit of dissent locally, let's leap on this and promote it as A, very powerful, B, representative of wider Iranian opinion when it isn't, the Gil Scott Heron, of course, said the revolution will not be televised. The powers that be in the West and indeed Israel are banking on a televised revolution, and I mean we've seen an enormous amount of disinformation about these protests circulating on social media. With clips of protests from many years ago being widely circulated, and with claims that they're contemporary, amongst other connivances. I think the reality. I mean, I saw someone post that they'd been traveling throughout Iran for a number of weeks, and they were shocked to hear that there was an ongoing revolution happening, because there is, there are vast pro-government protests which dwarf the dissenting political actions of a very select group of people within Iran. And yet, we've not seen the deployment of US or Israeli military assets closer to Iran, which tends to suggest that A, they've learned their lesson from the failure of the 12-Day War, where, yes, it would say Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly stated that this was going to end in the destruction of the Islamic Republic. And then this fantasy got battered down by the sheer weight of reality, which is that Iran has weapons that Israel cannot counter, let alone prevent from striking Tel Aviv and other major cities in their gruesome secular colonial entity. But more generally, I think as well that there is that we should always be very careful when protests in a foreign country are reported, because that when when footage is bombarded now via social media, but also via news media, it's very easy to overestimate the strength and size of these protests. I found myself kind of in the midst of this in late 2023 in Serbia, where there were these very small anti-government, I'm talking like a few hundred people. There were these very small anti-government protests, and the Western media leaps on this as if it was like countrywide, right? By like a few hundred morons causing havoc in central Belgrade, while the rest of the city carried on its business, unmolested. This was being talked up as like, oh well, a revolution is dawning in Serbia. And I had this was at the end, as I said, it's the end of 2023. I had this very disconcerting and kind of like almost like amusingly surreal experience of walking around Belgrade on December the 25th, when it was very sunny, it was very warm, it was like 20 degrees, and there were people sat outside bars drinking, and it was a very happy, calm, peaceful city. And then every time I looked at social media or news reporting on what was happening, it was as if the government was on its last legs and about to collapse. And millions of people have taken to the street to voice their condemnation of the sitting government, when in reality it was like a few hundred people. I have relatives and friends of mine back in the UK who were just going off Western media reporting, messaging me saying, "Are you okay?" Like, because it's because the obvious the assumption to make was that was this unrest was, nationwide and all encompassing, when it was absolutely tiny. And it didn't really register on the radar of average citizens whatsoever. And I think this is kind of the same situation here, where I've seen some prominent Twitter accounts claim that, oh, Tehran has fallen for the protesters. This is just not true, like, at all. And there is a very, very well funded, and maybe not particularly impactful or successful, but there is a much wider social media effort, just to relentlessly focus on these protests as if that's the only thing happening in Iran right now. And yeah, so I mean, I think we need to take all of the news emanating from Tehran, if you can call it that, with a massive side order of salt, to say the least.
Yes. I think the two things that come out of what you were saying now, one is the question of, well, who is the target for this enormous propaganda campaign? Because it's not really ordinary Iranians, I don't think. Most ordinary Iranians aren't watching, channels sponsored by the NED, or they're not watching BBC Persia, maybe Al Jazeera, which is, of course, very much in agreement with the regime change operation against Iran. But the propaganda put out by like CNN, BBC, ITN, Sky, etc., it strikes me that the main target for that is actually the Westerners. It's actually the imperial core countries who are the targets of this propaganda. And the reason why they are is, well, there's several reasons why, but I think the main one is to prime the population for further military action against Iran in the United States, and also in like the Western European countries. And one of the ways they do that is, again, it's the same model that was applied to Yugoslavia, which we have talked about extensively. CR Yugoslav Wars Special Edition, 2-parter on the YouTube channel. But the point about that is, like, they curated a reality that was sold to the Western populations about the evil Serbs committing atrocities. We must act now. This is the same playbook that they're working off now, which is, it's the same, all the same beats. The regime is committing a genocide. You must stop now, etc., etc. Trump makes threats of intervening if the Iranian government dares to repress protesters, etc., etc. And again, the principal reason to do this is because they clearly expected these insurrections to have far more purchase than they did. And they thought they would be in a position where maybe some kind of bombing campaign would finish off the Iranian government by the time of the last weekend that's just gone. When that didn't happen, they sort of didn't know what to do, because they don't really know what to do when their plans go awry, when a government doesn't just implode, when a government doesn't capitulate, when a population makes it clear that they don't want whatever it is that the US and its allies are selling. Then they've really got nowhere left to go, because militarily they don't have the option of actually invading Iran. It would be close to impossible for the US and its allies, given the current balance of forces. And the no US administration, certainly not this one, wants to send in its army unless it's got an absolutely near 100% chance of winning. We discussed in a previous episode the events in Venezuela, and you look at that, and like we discussed how the US will only send like a special forces raid in when they are pretty certain they're not going to get shot back at. And in the case of an attempted invasion of Iran, not only would they get shot at, but they would probably lose a hell of a lot of men and resources, which their fragility of the imperialist system really can't stand to lose those. And so they have very limited options. The best that they can manage are these foreign-sponsored riots, which again don't appeal to 90-odd% of Iranians, and then running they're going back to running the hybrid war on Iran, which includes like the economic siege of Iran via sanctions, the attempted military intervention in Iran via bombing campaigns, etc., via that they tried back in the middle of last year, and of course via the eternal so-called pro-democracy riots. And when none of this works, they just don't know what to do. And so, like, this all started just after Netanyahu went over to the United States to have a meeting with Trump. So it's clear that the usual cabals in Washington were pushing towards some kind of action. But again, like, because the Iranian government maintains a broad level of support in society and can mobilize that support in form of mass demonstrations, the Western agents clearly backed off. And whereas, as you said, Kit, in your contribution just then, on social media, you could live in a world where the Iranian government had fallen, and you could live in a world where that the picture that J.K. Rowling tweeted out of a Canadian woman, Canadian pro-monarchist exiled Iranian, lighting a cigarette off the burning picture of the Ayatollah, was represented as something that was happening in Tehran today. That was from Canada 4 years ago. Demonstrations against Trump in LA were put on big Twitter accounts as being Tehran right now, when it's obvious it's Los Angeles. People read demonstrations that happened in Iran years ago or in other West Asian countries years ago as if it was the gospel truth of what's happening now. So you can live in a reality where the Iranian government is no more, but it's a fake reality. And like so many of the West's wars, what it comes back to is that they can't actually win a real victory, so they keep creating media events in the hope that their psyop will catch on. And it never quite does with Iran, does it?
No, and what's interesting is in July last year, which feels a hell of a long time ago, even though it really wasn't. The Institute for National Security Studies, which is this Tel Aviv-based think tank, which is enormously influential on Israel's defense and security policies, it published a document advocating for regime change in Iran, while acknowledging that all prior efforts to achieve this had failed miserably. And they'd failed to such an extent that they were actively counterproductive to this goal. So, for instance, per INSS, and I would urge people to read my own kind of write-up of this, because I mean the report was just absolutely extraordinary. They acknowledged that Israel bombed Evin prison. They blitzed it on June 23rd, which is a few days into the 12-day war, and this was intended to be a symbolic blow to encourage public mobilization. And the reality is scores of average Iranians, including prisoners at the prison and their family members, and administrative staff and their lawyers, were either killed or were turned against Israel's intervention because they were just disgusted by this gross act of belligerence, completely arbitrary, and yes, like for far too many people, fatal. And it was even condemned by the Western media and Amnesty International. I mean, it was like that much of a catastrophe from Israel's perspective. But despite this, the INSS, they remain completely dedicated to fomenting regime change in Iran and believe that this is a viable prospect. While also kind of admitting that yes, that everything that we've done so far to try and destabilize, if not unseat the government, has just played into the government's hands. And it's like the IRGC, this has boosted their credibility because they are viewed as defending Iran from foreign incursions, which they are literally doing. But I mean, the point is well, some tweets that go viral on social media featuring videos of protests which are not happening in Tehran. Yeah, I mean, you could win an imaginary war, but then the reality hits you in the face, and it's often deeply unpleasant. And I mean, yeah, that we've seen this in Ukraine, where um, until probably the end of the much vaunted and utterly catastrophic counteroffensive, we were told that Ukraine was winning, that they were going to prevail, that they were pushing Russian forces out of their territory. And then it's like we fast forward to today, and like, ooh, Ukraine is absolutely fucked. And it's to the point that this can't really be spun anymore as anything other than an absolute disaster, not only for Kiev, but also for foreign backers in London and Brussels and Washington, in Washington to an ever lessening extent, it must be said. But like as we've discussed on Decline and Fall Passing, this Anglo-American obsession with information warfare, which stretches back a very long time, I get just in the interest of self-promotion. I've just written about the 10-day war in Slovenia, which basically guaranteed Slovenia's independence. So the Slovenian propagandists were peddling, relentless information warfare about how they were engaged with the Yugoslav army in these grand battles, and they were pluckily prevailing, in this kind of David and Goliath battle. The media reported on this, unquestioningly, to the extent of claiming that battles that hadn't happened actually have happened. But I think that, I mean, for all of its, many faults, social media now, there are people within Iran who are ready, willing, and able to push back against this. And there are also Iranians outside the country who are very, keen to push back against, lies about, how many regime forces have been destroyed, how many cities have been seized, because it's just not real. And then, yeah, you hit the reality of the fact that, like, Iran, despite its, many issues, it does have a very strong defensive capability. And that is at the forefront of Iranian government thinking is, how do we repel, external forces of disruption, destabilization, if not outright invasion. And we are seeing media outlets openly acknowledge that, well, things have now fizzled out in Tehran to the extent that this was ever a coherent, successful anti-government movement. It doesn't really exist anymore. Like, people have either given up or they've just gone home for tea. Because the likelihood of this toppling the government is zero, and it's particularly low if there's no concomitant intervention by foreign powers, which there isn't. And I mean, just to round out this point, I do think it's like it ever since the 12-day war failed, Israeli officials have been very, very keen to emphasize, well, we're going to go and do this again. But, like, actually, the muscle required to do this is just not there. Now, according to the Israeli government's own figures, the first 48 hours of the 12-day war cost $1.45 billion. And most of that was spent on defense rather than offense, it must be stated. Within days, they were out of missile interceptors. And they burned through an enormous amount of munitions, not really achieving anything. According to JINSA, which is this very shady Zionist lobby-funded think tank in the US, all of the stockpiles that were used by by Israel and the US failing to repel Iranian missile strikes, they're going to take between 3 to 8 years to replenish. like yeah, the muscle is just not there for a major military and indeed decisive military intervention. And we discussed in our recent special on the abduction of Maduro that, like, it seems quite clear that there was a deliberate stand down order, and Maduro effectively sacrificed himself. For all Trump's talk, bombastic talk of, different American energy giants, getting a slice of Venezuela's vast oil reserves, this is just hot air. It's not going to happen. Like, they managed to, I mean, in their eyes, remove the head of the snake. No, I mean, this is actually not achieved very much. It's actually probably backfired significantly, given the mass public outcry, not only the world over, but also in the US itself, at these actions. So, I mean, they can puff out their chests and tout supposed victories in the media and on social media. In real life, it doesn't really amount to anything at all.
No.
And just to finish this point, and I've been probably talking too long. I see that there was footage emerged of the Iranian monarchy's flag being hoisted at the Iranian embassy in London, and the Islamic Republic's flag being removed, and God knows what was done with it afterwards. But it's like there does seem to be this unending belief by the Anglo-Americans that, well, we can create reality. Whatever we say is the case, irrespective of the facts on the ground.
Yes. Well, there is, there is a desperate need by the US, the Brits, those two especially, to secure the collapse of the Islamic Republic because for various different reasons, for the same reason they tried to subordinate Venezuela. Part of it is to do with Iran's place in the global oil trade. Part of it is to do with the strategic position of Iran, which is, of course, very close to both Russia and China. And also the need to undo the alliance that Iran has, or alliances that Iran now has, with China and Russia, which bringing those three together is a real defining force and very powerful force for the Central Asian region, shall we say. And imperialism, for all those reasons and more, needs Iran to be destroyed and returned back to being back to vassalage, basically. But of course, they have been unable to do that for all their attempts at doing it. And again, we are faced with a very real problem for them, which is that they managed to do over and create these color revolutions, internal coups, etc., in countries which are ruled over by what I would define as weak oligarchical regimes, which don't have any real popular support within the masses. Iran's not like that. Iran isn't like Ukraine in 2014, where it was a competition between two different sets of oligarchs. Iran, because it has this revolutionary legacy, and because it has this legacy from the Islamic Revolution, where there's a heavy pro-working class element to it, it still receives the support from the great majority of the Iranian working class. It has a level of popular participation in its system, which a lot of other countries, including those allied with the US and Britain, simply do not have. So this is a different beast that they're dealing with here. It's one that can actually mobilize popular support, and they don't know what to do with that. And also, it's been revealed that they can't actually invade. These are, to use the American term, these are flat track bullies, which is that they can't stand to actually come under physical threat themselves, because if they tried to invade Iran, it would lead to a total disaster for Britain and the United States, militarily speaking. Iran is a much, much tougher nut to crack than any of the colonial wars that the US and the British have engaged in over the last 20-odd years. It's proved itself to be resilient to all the maneuvers that the US has made. Which leads us to an interesting question, which is, well, what the hell does the US do now? Because they've tried again. It obviously hasn't worked. And I know Robert the Bruce says, well, if first you don't succeed, try again. But I can't see Donald Trump having that patience. So the question is then, well, where does this go now? Because there's still the need they have to try and collapse Iran. There's no deal that Iran can sign which will satisfy the crazed desires of the imperialists in Washington and their servants in Tel Aviv. So where do we go from here is the interesting question, given the extremely contradictory nature of the Western approach to these things, given the fact that there is that objective need for the West to collapse Iran. No matter what agreement that the West says they're in favor of, I don't think any Iranian government will ever trust them because of the track record that they have of as soon as an agreement is signed, it is either cancelled or thrown in the garbage can. And also, even when you sign agreements with the West and you think you're doing better in terms of trade, they're still funding your enemies inside the country to try and destabilize you anyway. So we've reached the point where it has to be said that for nations like Iran, dealing with the US, dealing with the British is becoming like a risk that is just simply not worth taking. Because any dealings you have with them will come with a list of demands from them to allow their agents out of prison, to stop hunting them down, to allow their agents free usage of all the resources of the country that they wish to have made available for them. But this isn't sticking anymore. None of this is working, and they don't know what to do. And so the question is, like, to repeat the question, like, well, where do they go from here? Do they just come back to this in another few months' time and like it's round 3, round 4, round 5? Or are we reaching the point, do you think, where somebody in the White House is going to essentially roll the dice on some kind of other military intervention, which also won't work either? But I think they're getting desperate enough to try something because Israel's not looking too good these days. Trump's fantasies in Venezuela will get exposed pretty soon as being just fantasies. He's not the president of Venezuela, despite what his Wikipedia account says. And the billions of dollars that are going to pour in from Venezuelan oil will end up not turning up because even the American oil industry is clever enough smart enough to realize that there's mass opposition in the streets to American imperialism in Venezuela. So all the riches that he thought we was going to get from that won't turn up either. So the empire keeps rolling the dice with the same old methods, dressed up now in Trumpian language, and it still doesn't work. So what do you reckon the next move will be here? More of the same or upping the ante?
Well, I mean, I think that this we've discussed repeatedly on Decline and Fall, and it does bear repeating. It's sheer lack of imagination that these people have, and it's like, as I mentioned, Pahlavi, the Shah's son, giving his blessing, an endorsement to protest movements in Iran, if not outright claiming to be leading them, is the kiss of death for anti-government protests in Iran. And I must stress that it does appear that the clearest sign that the recent unrest was completely inorganic and being stirred up from the outside is there was no triggering event. Like it just started for no apparent reason, and then has quickly fizzled out. And it's like, during the past few days, we have seen Pahlavi touted again as the country's leader in waiting. And it's like, this is a guy who has zero organic support, zero credibility. He's viewed as poison within Iranian society. I might add as well that like he's openly stated, or is good as, that, well, he enjoys his life in the West and doesn't particularly want to return, quote unquote, home. So it's like, this is all you've got from, and we go back to and Brian Beletic, the mighty, he has been recently posting a lot about a 2009 Brookings Institute being this kind of elite US foreign policy think tank, which is funded by major corporations in the arms industry. They published a paper in 2009 called "Which Path to Persia," and it calls for starving Iran to death via sanctions, arming militants within the country to destroy the Islamic Republic from the inside, engaging in all sorts of deceit and deception and dishonesty in order to try and frame Iran as the bad guys and foment, manufacture public consent in the US and elsewhere for the government's ouster. Been doing this ever since, and we're coming up. Such as the pace at which events move, we're almost 20 years removed from this blueprint, and they don't have any new ideas whatsoever, like at all. And this is just really quickly just finish this point. I might add as well that like the INSS paper that I quoted I drew on extensively in my investigation, that it repeatedly notes that, well, one of the worst things that we can do if we want to promote regime change in Iran is align with the Iranian diaspora who applaud aggression against their home country, because this disgusts and repulses the perspective of the general population, but also the diaspora movement itself. It is a very small number of loud voices who openly called for military action to be taken against Iran. The INSS report explicitly and repeatedly argues against, quote unquote, aligning with pro-Western and pro-Israel diaspora groups that push for revolutionary change. And then yet, this is now over 6 months later, they haven't heeded these lessons at all. It's the same script over and over and over. In terms of like dice rolling, it's like genuinely, it's like it just seems that they're just obsessed with, well, we've got this one stratagem that we know, how to, how that we think will undermine Iran, and therefore it will. And they just keep going for it. I've reported on how Freedom House, which is closely tied to NED, etc. That they that like have called for the creation secretly, led by Carl Gershwin, who's the former head of NED. That they have repeatedly called for the creation of some kind of anti Islamic Republic coalition. And then, like, in the documents, they put forward people like Bill Kristol, like who's just like who's this like deranged neocon who is like just watching 1 or 2 minutes of him talking is enough to convince you that he's just some scumbag piece of shit. And like but he ranks highly amongst the people they want to promote as at the forefront of regime change in Iran. We see this with Mike Pompeo, who has lost a shocking amount of weight. Presumably, there's a portrait of him in an attic somewhere getting fatter. And he was, as you mentioned, boasting about how Mossad was in Iran. This is a guy who has taken enormous payments from MEK, the supposedly communist resistance to the Islamic Republic, and is very much lined with figures and movements related to Iran, which are not popular locally. MEK has killed an enormous number of innocent Iranians, and it's anti-government agitation in the country. And like he's at the forefront of this. What's going to be the response of like any average Iranian to the head of the CIA, who also as well was like cheering the assassination of what was his name? Soleimani. Sorry, yeah. Like who was behind the assassination of Soleimani, which was grieved and publicly protested by millions of people in a country. And it's like, but he's gonna be the guy who's gonna win hearts and minds in Tehran.
Yeah. Well, this is what happens when you've got no other options left, because again, like this isn't the unstable regime of the old Qajar monarchy from the early 20th century. the British can't send in some advisors to Tehran and basically tell the rulers to adopt their favored trade policy anymore. You can't just sail an aircraft carrier group up to the shores of Iran and expect anybody to be scared anymore because, well, the Yemenis proved the hollowness of the U.S. Navy and Air Force in action. And Iran's got a whole load of stuff that could make a real mess out of the U.S., and the Americans know it. So your gunboat diplomacy, so called, isn't going to work. The Iranian system is more durable than, again, can survive assassinations. It can even survive if they want to try and do a repeat of this smash and grab job on Maduro. Again, the Iranian system could probably survive that, though I don't think the helicopters would get in, should we say, untroubled in Iran. So the question is, well, what have they got left? So who are the opposition forces inside Iran that they try and work with? Well, again, like there's the MEK is completely bananas cult that was. Are they still based in Albania? I think they've been asked to leave.
Oh, some of them, some of them are, yeah. I mean, but like, I think they've outstayed their welcome, to say the least. Yeah.
Even the Albanian authorities don't want them around anymore. So they're like a cult with like practically zero support on the ground in Iran. They couldn't be able to make up a new government. So you've got them, and you've got Iranian monarchists who are some of the most deranged lunatics I've ever met on the streets of perfidious Albion. Just to give you an anecdote, dear viewers and listeners, there used to be, well, there still is, like a weekly Palestine solidarity demonstration in the centre of Manchester, where I used to live. And when this got really big, it attracted a counter demonstration of a few Zionists, some Ukrainian fascists, one guy waving a Taiwanese flag frantically, one Azerbaijani nationalist, and about 12 Iranian monarchists who would all stand. It was like a sort of NATO hall of shame stood on the opposite side of the square from the Palestine Solidarity demo. And the Iranian monarchists were as rabid and as like foaming at the mouth crazy as the Zionists were, which it takes quite some doing. And like they really are like people who are just filled with rage at like they are no longer in charge of the country that they once regarded as theirs. And again, you look at what a lot of these people say, and it comes down to basically the fact that the Shah, their beloved leader, was removed by a revolt of Iranian workers and peasants. Fundamentally, that's what it's about. And they can't stand that. And they can't stand that they regarded themselves as the aristocratic, true, a lot of them go on about being Aryans as well, true rulers of the Aryan nation of Iran, etc., etc. So these people are crazy and have very little, as Kit says, have very little support on the ground. But this is all the US has got to work with. That and separatists in Balochistan and the Kurdish regions, which, by the way, just as an additional nugget of information, there was a report which has been confirmed by both Iranian and Turkish sources that the Turkish government collaborated with the Iranians in providing intelligence on a large crossing of American-backed Kurdish fighters into Iran. And due to this collaboration, the IRGC surrounded them and killed them all. So this was another another move being made by the US to stir up things in the Kurdish regions. They'll try again in Balochistan, I have no doubt, but there's not a lot that they've got left to play with here, and so this is eventually going to get to the point where they don't have the credibility or the resources to pull this off anymore. Spending a lot of time and a lot of effort building up these networks. And then what happens is the Iranian government lets them disgrace themselves, then rounds them all up and puts them on trial and executes them. And that's a lot of money down the tubes for no return, basically. So just on that, there is an additional point that I wanted to get your comment on, Kit, before we close up, which is that between the Iranians and the Turks basically eliminating a load of Kurdish fighters, and the Kurds in Syria getting basically ethnically cleansed by the gang who are now running Damascus. This seems to me yet another proof of like the people with some of the worst political leaders in the world are the various different Kurdish populations, because it seems like they keep attaching themselves to the US, Britain, and Israel. And every single time they get shafted, whether it's Iran, whether it's Syria, whether it's the promises of a Kurdish state in Iraq, which will never materialize because the Turks won't allow it. This has got to be some of the worst decision making that any group has made over the past 30 years. But I don't know if you wanted to come back on any of that. You're muted, mate.
Yeah, that's there's a common quote to emerge from the show. Sorry, guys, but yeah, I mean, I think yes, absolutely. But I think that like what's actually quite interesting is that the Kurdish lobby, as much as it exists, has been kind of silent on this. And you would expect them to be at least trying to exploit it for some, even purely for informational warfare purposes. But they've been very silent. They've been very quiet. And I again, to go back to that INSS report, it noted that that Iran is a state that prides itself on religious and ethnic diversity and inclusion, right? And so you have shockingly local Jewish supporters of the Islamic Republic, because they are protected and are safe and happy in Iran. The report specifically warns against encouraging separatist tendencies in Iran, which is of course a very common British and American tactic. We're seeing this ongoing in China now. This is a repeat theme in proxy wars in Russia and Russia's near abroad, including the current Ukraine proxy war. But the think tank observed that heightened public sensitivity to foreign attempts to promote ethnic fragmentation were going to backfire and would result in the population uniting even further. So it's like, yeah, they've painted the Anglo-Americans and their Israeli puppet, or is it the other way around? It's difficult to know these days. They've painted themselves into so many corners, and as we've discussed, they have no responses apart from let's just keep doing the same thing in the hope that it will produce a different result, which, as Einstein said, is the absolute definition of madness. I might add as well that yes, that the silence of the Kurds and their assorted international supporters, which obviously includes the CIA and MI6, it has been very marked actually, because I think that they worry quite reasonably that if the Iranian government was to fall, which is very unlikely, that actually they'd probably be worse off as a result. And I might add that yes, that there was a withering appraisal of, or call it a post-mortem of Iran's woman-like freedom, quote unquote, revolution, which this happened at the end of 2022. And as I mentioned, the second that the Shah's son endorsed the protest and claimed to be leading them, they collapsed at home because nobody wanted to be associated with the Shah of Iran. And there was this, as I mentioned, a withering post-mortem authored by Mariam Memar Sadeji, who is this Zionist lobby-connected exile who regularly calls for friendly bombs to rain on Tehran to free the population of this terrible theocracy. She wrote this essay basically tracking why the protest movement failed, and she explicitly noted that the fake king's close associates, they push extreme Iranian nationalism and openly called for violence and executions of Iran's enemies, which includes the Kurds. So it's like, all of these different groups who, I mean, it's kind of, similar to Syria. The downfall of Assad, which has been touted by the now former head of MI6, Richard Moore, as one of his greatest achievements, while he was in the post. Make of that what you will. It's actually opened up a can of worms. And it's created a massive power grab, but also a kind of power vacuum with different regional players pursuing different and indeed contradictory interests and objectives in the country. Whether Syria will still exist as a state as it does today, which is to say barely, in a year's time even, is very much an open question. So, like, I think that, yeah, I don't think this is going to happen, touch wood, but, like, even if the Iranian government falls, it's not going to end the revolutionary fervor of the Iranian people. It's not going to unite the population around one grand idea or candidate or movement. It's going to create an absolute nightmare. And then when you factor for Western powers, and you factor in the fact that, like, Iran has some seriously impressive weaponry, which they've used very sparingly, usually in shows of force to Israel, to demonstrate that, well, if you want to hit us, then we're going to hit you back 10 times harder, and you're going to regret it. That, like, I mean, what benefit does the West gain from this arsenal falling into the hands of Pahlavi or his acolytes, or a renewed and perhaps even more belligerent Iranian government? I mean, it must be stressed that there are, as we've discussed before, there are a lot of people in Iran who think the government hasn't gone far enough in terms of trying to neutralize Israel or US influence within the wider West Asian region. They could be replaced, much like in Russia, where replacing Putin is almost inevitably going to result in the installation of a far more hardline leader, who is considerably more willing to use force to achieve objectives. The same thing could happen in Iran. Overriding option, because Iran has resisted relentless attempts to subvert and reverse its revolution since 1979. There is, I'm sure, in London and Washington and Brussels into the bargain as well, there is a sense of, well, they're the one that got away, and they have this obsessional desire with trying to crush the Islamic Republic. But even in the very unlikely event that they do, it's not going to produce a rerun of the 1953 coup. It's not going to install some, comprador leader who bends the knee and much more besides, for Western leaders. And it's that, again, it must be stressed. One of the overriding things that I heard from people that I know in Iran, I saw from analysts in the country who are experts, genuine experts on Iranian affairs, who obviously never get any media traction whatsoever, is that the 12-day war with Israel, it united the public to an extent that they hadn't been in a generation, because Iran's the early years of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, I mean, they were typified by attempted counter revolutions. There was the 10-year-long Iran-Iraq war, which was intended to neutralize them. And I mean, the revolution itself was very bloody, and its success was contingent on a large number of people willing to martyr themselves to overthrow the Shah. And younger generations of Iranians haven't had that experience, but then they've had that experience now, courtesy of a US and Israeli attack on their country, which was explicitly and avowedly concerned being their government. So that is a uniting rallying call. I might add as well, just to extrapolate this more widely, that even the mainstream media now, I've seen several articles in recent months, has acknowledged that the West's kind of genocidal, rabid Russophobic rhetoric has produced a Russian public which is more united than ever. And they are more committed, even if they aren't, overly thrilled about the fact that about the war happening. They see NATO as an existential threat, and this war as neutralizing that threat. They are, people from all walks of life in Russia, irrespective of their age, their ideology, etc. They are united behind the government like never before. And the same is true in Iran now. And it must be stressed that that there are videos of protesters violently attacking, if not outright murdering, security officials. This is not going to go down well with the general public whatsoever. It might be good for some social media clout, but that's about it.
Yeah. Well, this is where we've come to the end, I think, of the period of time
Yeah.
where this kind of tactic worked. And it doesn't work against a system which has like a mass popular base that can be mobilized in defense of the revolution, in the case of Iran. And the fact that they keep trying this tells us that they're all out of, not only are they all out of ideas, but they are spectacularly uninclined to do any kind of self-examination. If it didn't work, well, it was because, we weren't committed enough. We didn't do it hard enough. And so that they have literally like run out of ideas now. And also people are working this out. Like if you look at like, I know Twitter is not necessarily the real world, but like you see more and more people, even in the West, looking at the videos coming out of Iran and saying, that's fake, that's from Los Angeles, that's from, another country, this is from 5 years ago. Like, they're getting caught out more and more now. Might be why the British government's considering banning Twitter altogether, though I doubt they will, because there's so many times when we said they just get instantly dismantled. And you often hear like liberals talk about, oh, well, what would have been like if we'd have had Twitter in 1989? Well, in reality, you might have got exposed quicker because back then, as we talked about a little on our Victims of Capitalism episode, 30 years ago, you could, if you're the BBC, say, a BBC media twat, because everybody loves it when we say that, like John Simpson, for instance, or Martin Bell, another grotesque fraud that the fucking middle classes in Perfidious Albion are in love with because he wore a white suit once. They could go on TV at 10 o'clock on a weeknight and do a 5-minute piece to camera showing a tight angle shot of, say, a pro-democracy protest in Belgrade, and say everybody here wants the fall of the regime, or they could do the same thing in 1989 in Beijing. And this would commonly be accepted because they were the only voices then that were out there. Now everything gets instantly debunked. So yeah, you get a lot of fakes. You get a lot of like idiots like J.K. Rowling retweeting like fakes. But again, equally, you get a lot of instantaneous exposures. And we like to think here at Decline and Fall that we play a small part in those instantaneous exposures and provide you with the valuable historical context in which to understand this declining and falling in, as we've been discussing for the past hour, decrepit empire now. Because this is like, as well as like having its second decrepit and possibly senile emperor in a row in the form of Trump, who was last seen apparently smelling strongly of farts and wandering around the table at the oil executives meeting, boasting of a ballroom that didn't exist yet. The decrepit empire can no longer manage its old tactics anymore. To be crude about it, can't get it up anymore without a significant amount of financial assistance. So that brings us to a close today on this special episode of the Decline and Fall Show. We will be back to you again very soon, returning to our usual excellent programming schedule, bringing you all the latest from the highways and byways of the declining and falling empire, and looking at the perhaps the world to come as well. It only remains for me to bid you farewell for this week from a undisclosed location in Scotland, and to throw over for the last word in the episode to you, Kit.
Oh, well, no, thank you very much, Alex. It's very charitable of you. No, yeah, we hope you enjoyed this special emergency broadcast on the non-Iranian revolution. We have some even more specials planned in the immediate future. We may be joined Alex has some familial commitments, which mean that we may be having a special guest host for a few editions of Decline and Fall, but we will still be broadcasting and we'll still be giving you up-to-date views and analysis on the inexorable collapse of Anglo-American global hegemony, long overdue as it is. But thank you so much for joining. Please like, share, subscribe. If you can, donate. If you can't, we won't take it personally. But yeah, I said this at the conclusion of our last broadcast last year, how time flies. We have been stunned and humbled by our show has grown. We want to grow it in further. And yeah, given the state of algorithmic suppression that we are subject to, every little helps. Whether that's a like or a comment for the algorithm or whatnot, and it's always a gift that we gratefully receive. So thank you for joining us. See you very soon, and take care of yourselves.